Hello, good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to present the involvement of British intellectualism in the music of India. We will start with the brief introduction. There was no concept of a note fixation. Artists were free to choose the pitch for specific performance. The rest of the instruments were tuned accordingly. The unique and different thing they had was the Shruti system. There were 22 Shrutis divided all over an octave. In addition, they had 72 Melakarta scales based on different combination of notes. While the West had modes, major and minor scales, unaccustomed to such intricate details, the imperial masters disapproved the Indian classical music and called it a lowbrow and naive, which is still not accepted by most of the gharana of Eastern classical music. Though his system got official recognition, it destroyed the aesthetical and emotional characteristic of Indian classical music. The Indian musician adopted a new system to get recognition and acceptance from the lords. The unique form of Eastern classical music, which was more complex but more flexible at the same time, for the artist to perform and listener to enjoy. The impact of Western scale, its standardization and alteration of the diatonic structure of the raga by implanting the tempered scale into the music system of India. The pedagogy of Indian classical music was based on the orally transferred culture from guru to shisha and from ustad to shagird. The guru teacher was not only responsible for teaching musical scales to his students, but he was also responsible for their character buildings, ethics, morals, and acts as a spiritual guide to become an artist. M.K. Raina elaborated this concept. He said, the Guru as an authority permeates Indian history and all realms of Indian religion, philosophy, and expressive arts. Since the time of the Vedas, there have been prescriptions for the qualities of an effective guru. The guru word derived from the two roots gu meaning darkness or ignorance and ru meaning light or complete annihilation. The above statement is simple explanation of the link between a teacher and a student in a mythical pedagogy. The devotional transformation of knowledge from one generation to the next generation. The raga is a form of Eastern classical music which based on the Shrutis in an Eastern scale. For instance, the Gandhara note of Darbari raga is not the same as in ragas of Eastern classical music. It is the beauty of the raga to perform in the Shruti based scale. The swara differs from the Shruti concept in Indian music. A Shruti is the smallest gradation of pitch available, while a swar is the selected pitches from which the musician constructs the scales, melodies, and ragas. The Natshastra identifies and discusses 22 Shrutis and 7 swaras per octave. This statement showed the basic concept of Indian classical music, that is based on the Shruti divisions. Each ragas has different placement of the notes for the succession of the raga to born. The most well-known example of Shrutis is probably the use of the Ati Komal extra flat Gandhar in Raga Darbari. Others include the Rishabh in Bhairav, the Nishab in Bhim Plasi, and Miya Malhar, and the Gandhar in the Todi. The British came into the subcontinent for doing business of some spices. In 1876, the British took over the official charge of all India and British Raj started under the command of the Crown. British Raj period of direct British rule over the India subcontinent from 1858 until the independence of India and Pakistan in 1947. The Raj succeeded management of subcontinent by the British East India Company. After general distrust and dissatisfaction with company leadership resulted in widespread mutiny of sepoy troops in 1857, causing the British to reconsider the structure of governance in India. The British government took possession of the company's assets and imposed direct rule. The Raj was intended to increase Indian participation in governance, but the powerlessness of Indians to determine their future without the consent of the British led to an increasingly adamant national independence movement. When the people of India were showing distrust on the company governance, the story of India is getting more complex than it is mentioned in the documents. Both India and Pakistan are not stable even after 70 years of independence from the British Raj. What was done in that period is noticeable. How the power was transferred into the people who became the puppet of the British to plant their alien culture in the Indian roots. They empowered the people who surrendered against the British Raj, killed the people who were the real rulers of the land. It can be said that the British was trying to evoke the marriage system in India, but if that system was so refined, why today's subcontinent is living under the line of poverty and unjust society? It had a lot of resources of British industrialization needed the fuel. The fuel was supplied from the colonial land of the India to stabilize the colonial adventure of the British Raj. There is no doubt that the Indians are also responsible for the colonial disaster, but if someone is trying to pretend in itself a civilized nation, they have some responsibilities as well to protect their position. Bringing all resources back to British and the country which was the most wealthy country of that era destroyed and divided into two by leaving the Kashmir issue for the rest of the time. Civilized nations don't attack other nations, in my general opinion. If we see the subcontinent history, always nations from the outer land attacked on the people living in the subcontinent. There is not a single war that people of subcontinent attacked or looted any other nation. Pandit Vishnu Narayan Bhatt Khande has a very important place in the history of Hindustani classical music. He was born in a respected Brahmin family in district of Mumbai in a town called Vakeshwar on 10th August 1860. He started practicing law after finishing his BA LLB studies. He used to frequent music concert and carefully listen to many vocalists and instrumentalists. That is when he realized that many accomplished artists are not familiar with the rules of the ragas and moreover they are not even interested in music theory. He traveled northern India and learned about North Indian classical and Hindustani music. When some musicians refused to teach him anything unless he made a commitment by a formal ceremony of Ganda Bandhan, Pandit Bhat Khande did not hesitate and went through with the ceremony. He wanted to learn this music and organize it in a systematic way in which he can divide and organize it. His contribution in the documentation of the music, lyrics, and ancient music gaikis as he found and preserved them for the next generation. He also wanted to preserve the melody of the structure of a raga in a written form, and that's why he came up with the idea of the documentation of the music in Indian classical music. He introduced the Tat system. The concept of Tat is not exactly equivalent to the Western musical scales because the primary function of a Tat is not as a tool for music composition but rather as a basis for the classification of rags. Many controversies arose as before the rag were divided on the basis of melas, jati, rasas, time, seasons, and sometimes rag, ragnia, a concept of the gender of a rag. The third system is almost a copy of Western system, or Western modes are a copy of Indian ancient scales. This is still a question. This system was already known as a jati system in the Indian classical music. This was not as popular as the grama or mela system, which is based on the shruti system in Indian classical music. After the British approval, this system was made official for all music of that era. I'm also touching and mentioning the table from the Jealous Boy book. Here we can see a very important thing in these comparisons, that all moods of ancient Greek music are present in the Indian classical music, but there are a number of classical Indian music scales that are not present in the Western music. Here it is clear that the Greek music had an influence of Indian classical music in ancient times. As both civilizations were flourishing at the same time, Western music practitioners neglected the emotional static of these Indian scales. Indian music had 72 melas and 32 scales when British came in power. The British were only aware with the seven modes and were alien to the Indian musical scales. The normal Western ear were not trained for the Shruti based Grama system, which was the base of the Indian classical music. They were not able to understand those scales and their emotional statics. They discredited the local musicians. If we look into the history of music, we can see that the string instruments were firstly developed by Indians in ancient times. In some scriptures, it is also mentioned that even 1000 BC, India had string instruments. According to Raina, the veena is the oldest known Indian instrument, which is referenced in ancient Vedic texts dating as far as 1000 BCE. The instrument, which is typically played with the musician sitting on the ground, is seen in Hindu carvings. Another veena is found in the Rig Veda and Atharvan Veda, but in the 2000-year-old Sangam Tamil literature, we don't find veena but yas. Yal is similar to veena, a string instrument. It is quite clear from the above statements that I mentioned, the string instruments and the division of notes were present in old Indian civilizations. Indian tends to use these musical instruments in temples. They were aware with the division of notes even in the old times. The Pythagoras researchers discovered these scales from ancient India and practiced only these seven scales, unfortunately, which became a Western style of music. The lake emotional static in these scales, which Indians were using for feeding their soul for centuries, several scholars accepted the travel of Pythagoras to India for philosophical and spiritual knowledge. But Indians relied on oral tradition and taught their students in a mystical way. Their major part of spiritual philosophy had music involvement in it. In our person's words, the 3rd century AD sophists Philostratus claims that in addition to the Egyptians, Pythagoras also studied under Hindu sages in India. We can find in history the string instrument in India. These instruments were working before his work on the division of scales. It simply explains that the Indian had his knowledge of making string instruments and enjoy its emotional statics. The Pythagoras was interested in the intellectual side of the musical scales as Bhatkhande did, ignoring the emotional statics of the musical system that India had. The hybrid scales of music that is still in practice were authenticated as official scales. A newly developed system by the British Raj authenticated the documentation as they were following the intellectual mindset to unite the world in a new order. Although it was rejected by the Gharanas in the beginning, the native musician of that era later understood that there is no option to reject the new theories, so they started evolving and accepting the new thought system in music by Bhatkhande. Even nowadays, in theory, the music is not properly documented. There are many disagreements between the theorists and the performers. It was orally transferred tradition, so most of the culture has been lost in the changing of pedagogy system of music in India. The system of Indian classical music was more complex than it is understood by the historians and writers of that time. The artists were using diatonic notes to perform a specific raga. The beauty of each raga was based on the intonation of the same notes from a different frequency, which we can further elaborate as a shruti. Each raga has its own form of ga, ni, dha, which logically can be understood as an imperfect note. On the other hand, it was the beauty of the Indian classical music. The impurity of the Western tempered fixed scale comes with a change in the musical system of the India. Also, the terminology played a very important part because the Western terminology, when mingled with the Eastern terminology, it comes up with the new results which were different. The Indian music based on the intellectual and emotional aesthetics together to form a system. Relying on intellect only left the statical emotional pedagogy behind, resulted in the fall of Indian classical music as we discussed earlier. The system then transferred to the institutions where the devotional and emotional side of these scales were misinterpreted. Now we have the Indian classical music, which is based on the Western scales. It is hybrid form of music, which is not the exact form of pure Indian classical music. The evolution of classical music left classical performers into oblivion. The knowledge wasn't properly transferred to the next generation and it died in the history. This is not only the Indian loss but a global dilemma. As a student of music and culture, I'm not against of a rational approach to the arts. But we need to re-identify the mistakes of history and correct them for our next generation. The right contribution of our legends are notable, but we must learn from our mistakes as well. Thank you so much for your patience and attention. Have a good day. Goodbye.